All right, so this is goal 7 test review. If you know everything on this test review, you're going to do fine on the test. We're going to start by there was Zanita. Zanita, number 1, says, what is de jure segregation? All right. Good. Segregation is maintained by law. So during the Jim Crow period, that would be segregation that was like in movie theaters or doctor's offices or whatever, or buses or trains. Well, I guess Jim Crow era, we don't used to think of buses like trains. All right. Education number 2. What's de facto segregation?
Arises from economic, social, or other factors.
All right. Economic, social, other factors. Yeah, I think the way that I worded in the notes is maintained by custom. So whereas we talked about maybe school lunchrooms, or we talked about things like towns where you've got like a mostly African American section of town versus white section of town. We use Bethel as an example. That'd be de facto segregation. Angel, who founded the Niagara movement?
W.E.B. Du Bois.
Right. W.E.B. Du Bois. All right. Next one says, list progressive era state governors we talked about. RJ, who are those? Quinn, what do you got? Progressive era state governors, number 4. Damisha.
Robert M. Lafayette, Charles B. Aycock, and James Hall.
Right. Robert Lafayette was from Wisconsin.
Charles B. Aycock.
C.B. Aycock from North Carolina.
And James Hall.
Texas.
And James Hogg from Texas, right.
You got Texas.
You gotta know where they came from too.
I'd like to know where they came from. Remember, I told you the one to put a star in by your notes was Robert Lafayette. All right, number 5. Quinte says, what does the 17th Amendment do? Right. Led to direct election of senators, whereas up until that time, senators had been chosen by state legislatures. All right, number 6 says, what does the 18th Amendment do, Kiki? It did what? Prohibition. All right, and the Volstead was not part of the 18th Amendment. It was not part of the 18th Amendment. It was under that notes because I said that was passed to help enforce the 18th Amendment. You can't just read the notes. You got to pay attention on the days we do the notes. All right, number 7. Xavier says, what did the 19th Amendment do?
Say women's right to vote.
Right, women's right to vote. All right, next one says, what did Theodore Roosevelt do when the coal miners went on strike in 1902? Nick.
He settled the strike and gave the workers a 10% raise.
All right, sell the strike. I'm going to put sell the strike by threatening to take over the mines, yeah. And the arbitrators ended up giving the workers a 10% raise when they had wanted a 20% raise. All right, Isaiah number 9 says, what were Jim Crow laws? All right, somebody help me out. What were Jim Crow laws? Kier. All right. Okay, so it's de jure segregation. You're right. So I'm going to put laws enforcing segregation. And remember, we talked about the word Jim Crow came from a minstrel show actor's character. And that kind of stuck as a name for the laws. All right, Kiara, the next one, number 10, says, what were Henry Ford's innovations for the workplace? You get that?
Mass production technique, wage higher, shorter work week and work days, and workers as consumers.
All right. Yeah. You said shorter work day was 1. You said workers as consumers. Remember, workers as consumers means that if you pay your workers more, they can afford to buy your products. In Henry Ford's case, the cars. You said mass production techniques, so we'll say the assembly line. And she said higher pay, so I'm going to put it as the $5 day. Number 11. All right, Tia says, what did the Supreme Court do in U.S. versus E.C. Knight? You got that? Right. They failed to break up the sugar trust. So I'm going to put did not break up sugar trust. So we talked about some cases where the Supreme Court did break up trust under Roosevelt's administration. This was just before Roosevelt's administration where they let a sugar trust stay in business. All right, the next one, number 12. She was in actually a couple units, and we watched the SAS thing about history of the Standard Oil Company. Somebody raise your hand if you can tell me who wrote the history of the Standard Oil Company. Okay. Say who? It's Ida. You got the first name right. It's Ida Tarbell. All right, number 13. Dionysia, you answered this for me a minute ago. What caused the Wilmington race riot?
African American editor Wilmington record Chamberlain's viewpoint of interracial relationships.
All right. Put editorial in the Wilmington Record. You said challenge viewpoints on interracial relationships. All right, remember that was when he basically said that there were a lot of white women attracted to black men, which that was something that was really inflammatory in the South at that time. That led to the only coup d'etat in American history. And I'm going to put in parentheses there. Coup d'etat. It's when you have a sudden seizure of power. It was an illegal seizure of power by the Republicans, taken away from the elected Democrats. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. By the Democrats taking away from the elected Republicans at the time. All right, number 14 says, how Booker T. Washington thinks segregation and discrimination should end. Monica, did you get that, number 14? All right, proving economic independence, right.
Proving the game.
So what?
Prove again.
Well, either way, you say it. Through hard work. Remember, he thought that black people should start at the bottom of life and work their way up. And we looked at that little quote from his Atlanta speech where he said that it was like a ship's captain that's stranded, and they're telling him to cast down their buckets where they are. All right, number 15 says, who founded the Tuskegee Institute? Marissa? All right, Booker T. Washington. All right, number 16 says, describe the Atlanta Compromise speech. Don't raise your hand if you can tell me what that. Dionysia.
Washington advised blacks to begin at the bottom of the line.
All right. She said, Washington advised blacks to begin at the bottom of life. And remember, that was a speech that was given to a mostly white audience in the South. So that would probably been well received, but then a lot of African American leaders didn't like that. All right, number 17. Arthel says, who wrote How the Other Half Lives? Jacob Riis. All right, remember, he was one of those muckrakers that was trying to expose the ills in society and things that needed to be fixed. And 18 said, what did the Volstead Act do? And you remember the Volstead Act is associated with that 18th Amendment. All right, that provided funds, I'm going to put dollar signs, to enforce prohibition. All right, then 19 says, what provide funds or money to enforce prohibition. Number 19 says, what did the Supreme Court rule in Plessy v. Ferguson? That's the case we talked about all the way back to civics. Someone raise your hand. Tell me that one. All right, yeah, Kiki said that separate but equal was constitutional. I mean, that came from Homer Plessy being asked to move to the Jim Crow railroad car. All right, number 20 asks, what was the square deal? First off, which president was that associated with?
Theodore Roosevelt.
Right, Theodore Roosevelt. So I'm going to put T. Roosevelt's progressive agenda to improve American society. Yeah, that was his way of shaping legislation. You're right. That's why I said in the notes. Number 21 says, which president's plan was called the New Freedom? Woodrow Wilson. Yeah, that was what we just talked about today. All right, 22 asks, who were muckrakers? And I think you answered this for me earlier. What was it? Who were they?
They were writers that talked about the bad things.
All right, you can word it a lot of ways. She said talked about the bad things or exposed ills. I put wrote about social problems. So these were people like Lincoln Stephens and Upton Sinclair and Jacob Riis. And the next one asked about one of them. It says, who wrote The Shame of the Cities? No. That was Lincoln Stevens. All right, and The Shame of the Cities was writing about corruption in local government in cities. All right, number 24 says, which political party split before the election of 1912? Yeah, Republicans, because a lot of the old guard Republicans supported Taft, while the progressive Republicans supported Roosevelt and the new Bull Moose Party. All right, and then 25 asks you about that book that we discussed. We read excerpts from, made some of y'all not want to eat lunch. It says, what was the jungle about? What was it about?
The meat.
All right, I'm going to put it was about the meat packing industry, but I'm going to put in parentheses working conditions, because the original purpose was to expose working conditions in the meat packing plants, and it ended up making people sick when they found out what happened to meat packing plants. And who wrote that?
Jacob Lee. So it's live.
Upton Sinclair. I mean, he's one of those people we would consider a muckraker. All right, 26. I ask you, what two nations caused Taft to lose some support among progressives? I said two nations. I meant two issues. All right, we just said he signed a tariff bill, remember, that didn't lower enough.
And
So we
then
got
he wasn't as progressive.
tariffs and what did you say, Damisha? Conservation. All right, 27 asks you which movement was Carrie Nation involved. She's the little woman I showed you a picture where she had a hatchet in one hand and a Bible in the other. Not to what? All right, she was trying to get people to stop drinking alcohol, and we called that the temperance movement. And the temperance movement were people that were pushing for prohibition. All right, then 28 says, which tariff passed in the Taft administration angered progressives? That was in your notes today. It's the Payne-Aldrich Act. Remember where you had the House trying to do one thing, the Senate trying to do another, so they worked out where it was in the middle, and it really just ended up ticking everybody off. All right, number 29 says, who was the socialist candidate for president election 1912? Same guy we talked about stepping in, helping the American Railway Union, right? It was Eugene Debs. All right, last four says, 30 says, which law was passed in order to strengthen the Sherman Act? The Clayton Act, or Clayton Antitrust Act. 31 says, what was the crisis? It was the official magazine of what group?
The NAACP.
All right, official publication of the NAACP, and they published a lot of articles that were about anti-lynching and saying that there should be more federal government support for anti-lynching laws. All right, number 32 says, describe the Supreme Court's decisions in Northern Securities versus U.S. and American Tobacco versus U.S. I'm going to summarize that pretty briefly here and just say that they prosecuted, I'll put government prosecuted trust. I'm going to put one was ordered to reorganize. Remember, one of those cases was the one that established Teddy Roosevelt's reputation as a trust buster. And the last one, 33, says, which law prevented railroads from giving rebates? Start with the E. E.
How about the interstate?
All right, it was the Elkins Act. All right, again. You know this sheet. You're going to know the test pretty well, but also you need to make sure that you're studying that review sheet that's got the three faces where it's got Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, because there's going to be a matching section of the test with them.